The night begins not with sound, but with the absence of it. Snow drifts in slow silence across an empty field, each flake settling like the memory of a forgotten breath. Somewhere in the distance, a wooden door groans beneath the weight of frost. Inside, a single candle flickers, its trembling light the only defiance against the frozen dark. This is not a painting. This is life in the heart of a medieval winter, where survival was not assumed but negotiated with every dawn. Imagine standing there, centuries ago, your world no wider than the circle of warmth cast by that flame. The walls breathe cold air through the cracks. Your breath fogs and vanishes, a ghost rising toward the roof, beams blackened by smoke. The wind outside howls across fields stripped of colour, and the bones of trees claw at the grey sky. Nothing moves that is not desperate to live. There are no hums of engines, no distant lights of cities, only the stillness of snow and the faint, rhythmic creak of a dying ember. For the people who lived through these winters, time itself slowed. Days did not pass as hours. They sank like stones into darkness. The sun was a rumour that barely brushed the horizon before vanishing again. Those who survived spoke of the cold, not as weather, but as a living thing, something that crept into their homes, their lungs, their bones. They believed the cold listened, that it could sense weakness. To speak of fear too loudly was to invite it inside. It was not only the frost they feared, but hunger. The world outside their doors turned against them in winter. Streams froze solid, fields hardened into stone. The stores of grain and salted meat grew smaller each week. Every meal was measured in heartbeats, every mouthful a prayer that spring would return. The candlelight glowed over faces hollowed by the waiting, by the endless counting of days. Yet somehow they endured. The silence of a medieval night was both a comfort and a torment. When the wind rested, the world became so quiet that even a drop of melted snow could sound like a heartbeat. People learned to listen differently. They could tell the difference between the groan of a timber beam and the approach of a storm. They knew when an animal moved beneath the frozen crust, and when the wind carried something more. This deep listening was not a skill, it was survival. Without clocks, without fire beyond the hearth, time drifted like smoke. Families gathered around embers, eyes half closed, voices murmuring stories that stretched between waking and dream. Children fell asleep to the rhythm of whispered legends, while adults sat in thought, staring into the faint orange glow. The mind wandered differently then. It moved inward, circling the boundary between memory and myth. When the night stretched too long, they found warmth not only in flame, but in imagination. Some believed the cold could take a person's soul if they slept too deeply. Others whispered that snow itself had memory, that each flake carried a secret of the world before men. To live through a medieval winter was to live surrounded by mystery. Every morning that began with breath was an act of quiet defiance. Yet the cold revealed more than it destroyed. It stripped life to its essentials: warmth, shelter, hope. Those who survived understood endurance not as strength, but as patience. They learned that survival was not a victory over nature, but a partnership with it. Fire was borrowed from the forest, food from the earth, warmth from one another. In that understanding lay a kind of sacred humility, one that modern comfort has long since buried. When a blizzard rolled over the land, people disappeared from the landscape entirely. Smoke from chimneys vanished under white air, and villages seemed to hold their breath. Inside, everything slowed. The sound of dripping water froze mid-air. Bread baked from the last handfuls of grain filled the room with a smell that was both hope and farewell. Every sense sharpened the crack of ice outside, the whimper of a child in sleep, the long sigh of wind against the shutters. These were not sounds of despair, but of life refusing to yield. To understand these winters is to understand silence itself, the kind that presses on the chest and makes thought echo louder than speech. For medieval people, that silence was both enemy and teacher. It reminded them of smallness, of how thin the veil between comfort and death truly was. But within that quiet, they found meaning. The hush of snow became the voice of the divine. The frozen world became a mirror for endurance. There were no promises in those nights, only choices. Stay by the fire or step into the dark. Share what you have or hide it away. The candle burned lower. Its wax pooled and hardened like frozen tears. And yet, within that fragile light, there was beauty. The kind born not from plenty, but from persistence. When the wind finally slept, the world outside glittered like glass. The moonlight fell across the snow in a faint blue shimmer, and for a moment the cold seemed merciful. It was as if time itself had paused to breathe. In that stillness, people dreamed of spring, of warmth, of a life beyond endurance. They didn't know when it would come, only that it must. The medieval winter was not just a season. It was a passage, a narrow bridge between survival and surrender. Each day crossed it carefully, step by step, guided by instinct older than memory. And every night, when the last ember dimmed and the frost crept back in, they learned once more what it meant to be human. Fragile, fearful, and yet unbroken. Because when the fire died, and even time seemed to freeze, something within them refused to fade. A quiet courage, hidden beneath the cold, waiting for morning. And as the candle's final flame trembled, they whispered to themselves the same question that echoes still through history. How did they keep hope alive when the world itself turned to ice? The answer, like the warmth, waits in the next chapter. They believed winter spoke in its own language. Every gust, every settling drift of snow was a sentence in a conversation older than their prayers. To them, the cold was not punishment, it was instruction. A slow and patient teacher that stripped away what was unnecessary, leaving only truth. The frost reminded them that comfort was temporary, and faith was the only lasting warmth. In monasteries carved into hillsides, monks listened to that frozen voice and tried to understand its message. Their breath hung in the air like incense as they wrote by candlelight, recording small miracles that happened in the depths of winter. A loaf that lasted longer than it should have. A traveller who survived 3 nights lost in the snow. Each story became proof that endurance was sacred. For peasants in the valleys, the season was an examination of the soul. When the first snow fell, they whispered blessings to the sky. It was not celebration, but surrender, a quiet acknowledgement that the months ahead would test every bond, every belief. They had no clocks, no calendars, yet they knew when the hardest days approached. The world seemed to contract, sound dulled, colour drained, and the rhythm of life slowed to match the heartbeat of the earth. In that stillness, they turned inward, trusting the cycle to reveal its lessons. Many believed the cold carried spirits, invisible keepers who drifted between villages to watch the living. They left offerings at doorsteps, bread crusts, carved tokens, a drop of ale. Some called them ancestors, others angels disguised as frost. To offend them was to invite illness, so the offerings continued, generation after generation, until the habit became instinct. When storms howled across the hills, children were told that the wind was these spirits searching for warmth, testing which homes still remembered gratitude. Even suffering had ritual. Families would sit together through the longest nights, reciting prayers meant to calm both fear and hunger. The repetition became music, a low hum that filled the room until it almost felt warm. The elders told stories of frozen saints, wanderers who had perished in the snow, but were said to glow faintly beneath the drifts, their bodies uncorrupted, preserved as holy reminders of faith's endurance. It was believed that to find such a body was to receive a blessing, though few ever searched. To disturb the dead of winter was to challenge its authority. In this world, religion and survival were never separate. The church bell that tolled across a frozen village did more than mark time. It reminded people that they were still seen by heaven. When the bell rope froze stiff, they beat it with sticks until it rang again. The sound cracked through the air, like a spark proof that the connection between earth and sky still held. Monks spoke of the cold as God's breath, purifying and humbling, yet the same breath could kill without warning. This contradiction kept faith alive. The danger made belief feel urgent, immediate. Every sunrise was a small resurrection. To the wandering poor, those without walls or fire, winter revealed another kind of devotion. They followed the roads by moonlight, guided by distant steeples. Sometimes they found shelter in barns or chapels, where even the animals shared their heat. Those who survived the journey often spoke of visions seen through frost-blind eyes, figures of light walking beside them, voices whispering from the snow. Listeners debated whether these were angels or tricks of exhaustion, but all agreed that the cold stripped away illusion. In the silence, truth came close enough to touch. The wealthier households performed their own private rituals. Hearth fires were blessed on the night of the first frost. Herbs were thrown into the flames to chase away unseen malice. Windows were sealed with wax crosses, and servants sprinkled salt in corners to confuse whatever spirits crept indoors. Even nobles feared the long months of darkness. Their stone halls echoed with the same wind that battered the peasant huts. Winter was the great equalizer. No wall was thick enough to keep it entirely out. But beyond fear, there was reverence. The people did not only fight the cold, they addressed it. They sang to it, bartered with it, begged it for mercy. Some traditions spoke of speaking the frost away, a soft chant murmured at dawn while blowing over the hearth coals. It was said that breath warmed by faith could wake the fire faster than flint. Whether true or not, the act itself carried power. It gave them the illusion of control, a conversation with something vast and indifferent. The church tolerated some of these customs, condemned others. When priests saw villagers kneeling before snow-covered shrines of stone, they declared them pagan remnants. Yet even the clergy could not escape the pull of ancient fear. In quiet moments, they too crossed themselves at the sound of ice cracking on the river. They too watched their breath in the dark, and wondered if perhaps the old gods still lingered beneath the frost, waiting for acknowledgement. Winter united contradictions, faith and superstition, despair and wonder. It blurred the boundary between the sacred and the ordinary. When night stretched beyond endurance, people found meaning in everything. The direction of the wind, the way smoke curled from a chimney, the pattern left by melting ice on the window pane. Each sign was a message, each silence an answer. They lived in conversation with a world that refused to speak plainly. And through this dialogue, a strange peace emerged. To accept the cold was to accept limitation. To survive, it was to glimpse eternity. When spring finally returned, the thaw did not erase winter's lessons. It only hid them beneath green fields. The memory of endurance lingered in bones, in customs, in prayers whispered without understanding. As centuries passed, many of these beliefs faded. Fires grew hotter, walls thicker, and the world forgot that cold once had a voice. Yet traces remain in the superstitions of rural villages, in the stories of saints who glowed beneath the snow, in the quiet awe that still falls over a landscape blanketed in white. The teacher still waits, silent and patient, its lessons written in frost. For those who listen closely, the message is unchanged. Endurance is a form of faith, and faith is a kind of warmth. The ancients understood this without words. They didn't conquer the winter, they conversed with it. They survived not because they were stronger, but because they learned to hear what the cold was trying to say. And as the world drifts again towards silence, perhaps we too might remember how to listen. When the first frost sealed the earth, people turned inward and downward toward fire, not merely as warmth, but as something living. To strike a spark in the dead of winter was an act of faith, a promise whispered against the cold. The medieval mind did not see flame as a tool, it saw a soul. The hearth was its heart, and the home was built around it, like a body around a spirit. In that small circle of light, families gathered to breathe together, to remember that warmth was still possible. Fire had to be coaxed into existence, not demanded. A single mistake, a damp log, a careless breath, could smother it and invite the cold back inside. The flame was treated like a guest of divine origin, fragile but sacred. Monks wrote that to light is to summon, and that every spark carried a trace of the first creation. In their cloisters, they guarded embers through the night, tending them with a reverence normally reserved for relics. Some said these fires were blessed, that the smoke itself could carry prayers upward through the black sky. For the poor, the ritual was humbler, but no less holy. They saved the last coal from the night before, covering it in ash so it would smoulder through sleep. In the morning, it was uncovered like a buried treasure, gently blown upon until it woke. Children learned to hold their breath as their mothers leaned close, exhaling the smallest whisper of life into the coal until it glowed red again. That moment when dead ash turned to light was as miraculous as sunrise. They called it the breathing of the hearth. The act of making fire in winter connected them to something older than words. They believed the warmth came not only from wood, but from intention. If the flame was lit with anger or fear, it would burn unevenly. If lit with patience, it would last through storms. The flicker of light revealed more than shadows on the wall. It revealed the hidden mood of the household. Those who had seen too many winters could tell what kind of week it would be, simply by watching how the first flame moved. But fire was never just comfort. It was boundary and warning. Too much, and it destroyed. Too little, and everything froze. The villagers spoke of hungry fires that devoured wood faster than they should, and silent fires that gave no warmth at all. Some believed these were signs of unseen forces. When a house burned without cause, it was said the fire had been offended. Perhaps it had not been thanked. Yes, even flames needed gratitude. So before each meal, before sleep, they whispered small words to the hearth. Stay, guard, remember us. In grander halls, the rituals grew elaborate. Lords and ladies had their fires blessed by priests on the first night of Advent. Holy water hissed as it touched the coals. The crackle was believed to chase away demons hiding in the smoke. Yet beneath the chants and incense, there lingered a deeper, older memory, the sense that humans were never entirely in control of flame. It was both servant and judge. The same light that baked their bread could erase their homes in moments. They feared it, and rightly so. Monks wrote of midnight fires that burned blue before disaster, a colour thought to signal spiritual unrest. Travellers carried candles marked with protective runes, believing that a steady flame meant divine approval for their journey. Entire festivals revolved around controlled fire bonfires that symbolized the burning away of darkness itself. People would leap through them, throw herbs into them, whisper names of those they missed into the smoke. They were not worshipping fire, they were speaking to it. When a hearth went cold, it was treated as a death in miniature. The room would fall silent, the air heavy with unease. The family would huddle in their cloaks until someone dared to reignite the flame. That moment always carried tension. Would it take? Would it live? Sometimes it didn't, and the family waited in cold repentance, certain that something unseen had turned its back on them. When it did catch, a sigh moved through the room, a collective exhale of relief, gratitude, and awe. Beyond survival, fire shaped community. In villages, shared flame was an ancient bond. One house's hearth might rekindle another's, and with that coal came trust. If neighbours shared their embers, it meant peace. To refuse was to declare quiet war, and so warmth became language, a diplomacy of necessity. Fire united what the cold tried to divide. At night, when winds clawed at doors and snow hissed against shutters, the world outside disappeared. Inside, the hearth's light painted moving patterns on walls, and people swore they could see faces in the flames, faces of the dead, faces of saints, or perhaps only their own fears reflected back at them. They told stories in that shifting light, stories of spirits drawn to warmth, of travellers who followed the glow of unseen fires and vanished. These tales were warnings, but they were also comfort. They gave shape to the unknown, form to the darkness. In this way, winter's fire was more than survival, it was confession. The flames heard everything: arguments, laughter, prayers. They witnessed despair and renewal. To sit before one was to sit before judgment and mercy at once. People believed that when they died, their souls would become sparks returning to the great eternal fire that began all warmth and light. It was not fear that kept them tending the flames. It was the hope that, by caring for this small fire, they were tending a piece of eternity. The warmth they summoned each night was fleeting, but it was enough. Enough to remind them that even in the heart of darkness, something still burned. Something human, something divine, something beyond. And so the fire remained not just in the hearth, but in memory. Passed down through generations, it carried whispers of those who had once breathed life into ash. Their warmth, their faith, their fear all mingled in the smoke that curled into the night sky. Some fires were meant to burn brightly, others were meant to be hidden, and in those secret embers lay the beginning of all survival. There is a different kind of wisdom in the way they built their warmth, not from books or temples, but from the slow trial of winters that refused to end. Each village guarded its own small secrets. Some learned to carve ovens into the very walls of their homes, shaping hollow chambers of clay that could hold heat long after the flames had died. Others built stoves from stone so thick they glowed faintly for hours, releasing warmth like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Fire was not wasted, it was persuaded. Every ember mattered. The houses seemed alive. Beneath floors of packed earth, hidden tunnels carried the breath of the hearth to other rooms. Smoke crawled along wooden beams before slipping through narrow vents, warming the air as it escaped. Some called these whispering chimneys, for they sighed softly through the night, never entirely still. Peasants learned to seal windows with cloth soaked in animal fat, trapping every sliver of heat. In deeper cold, they hung woven mats over doors to muffle the wind. Survival was an architecture of patience. Whole families slept together, not only for affection but for warmth. They lay side by side under coarse blankets of wool and straw, breathing in rhythm, a single living furnace. The youngest were placed between the elders, protected by their steady heat. Outside, frost painted delicate veins across the glass, tracing the outline of unseen hands. Inside, a kind of quiet trust filled the air, the understanding that warmth, however fragile, could be shared into existence. Their methods reached beyond firewood. Some villages built earth mounds over their homes, turning the soil itself into insulation. Others gathered stones from riverbeds and heated them through the evening, wrapping them in cloth to sleep beside. They called them night hearts. In the morning, the stones were still faintly warm, holding the memory of the flame. Even the poorest could keep a few, passed down like relics from one winter to the next. There was tenderness in this exchange between human and element. Charcoal became a treasure. It burned cleaner, longer, and without flame, perfect for nights when light could invite thieves or spirits, but making it required secrecy. Men watched the forest carefully, choosing only certain wood, covering their fires with earth so the smoke rose thin and blue. If too much air reached the pile, the fire turned wild. If too little, it smothered and died. It was said that the best charcoal was made under a new moon, when even the stars hid their gaze. The process bordered on the forbidden, half craft, half invocation. Some fires were deliberately hidden, buried beneath layers of ash or clay to keep their glow alive through snowstorms. In the morning, the ash was peeled back to reveal a single red pulse. Those who tended such embers spoke of them as if tending souls. "Never let it sleep without breath," they said. "It remembers you." These small rituals blurred the line between practicality and devotion, between warmth and worship. To watch a coal awaken beneath cold fingers was to witness resurrection. But warmth was not always safe. In cramped cottages, smoke gathered thickly beneath low ceilings. Eyes watered, lungs ached, yet few dared to open a vent for fear the heat would flee. The air shimmered with a faint haze, a slow suffocation mistaken for comfort. The line between life and death was measured in the thickness of the smoke. Some families learned to keep herbs burning among the embers, juniper, sage, or rosemary, to sweeten the breath of the house and drive away illness. Others tied small bones above the hearth, charms against the invisible. They said the bones listened for sickness and cracked when danger drew near. Villages shared their methods in whispers. When travellers passed through, they carried not just goods but stories of distant places, where houses were warmed by the ground itself, or by water heated in deep hidden springs. These tales were half truth, half longing, yet occasionally a traveller would show proof, a stone that stayed warm even in snow, a sketch of a tunnel that breathed heat from beneath the mountain. Listeners nodded, believing these were remnants of a wisdom older than Christendom, fragments from civilizations that once mastered the balance between fire and frost. Over time, some of these techniques were outlawed. The church distrusted what it could not bless. Fires lit without ritual were labelled pagan. Warmth summoned without prayer was called witchwork. Charcoal makers worked at night, their faces blackened by soot, their trade whispered of in fear and envy. Yet even priests relied on their product to heat their abbeys. It was a quiet hypocrisy that everyone accepted, for survival was beyond sin. As centuries passed, these customs sank beneath newer habits. Hearths were rebuilt, chimneys grew taller, and the old knowledge scattered like ash in the wind. But fragments survived in the way grandmothers still banked coals before sleep, in the way builders curved walls inward to cradle heat. Even now, in forgotten valleys, some families light their first winter fire with coals saved from the last. They call it the memory flame. To let it die would be to break the chain that links them to the dead. The warmth of those nights was never perfect. It wavered, it failed, it returned. Yet in that fragile repetition lay a quiet triumph. Each rekindled flame was proof that humanity could make light out of darkness, that faith could become tangible. The villagers didn't see themselves as clever, they saw themselves as guided. The world tested them, but it also taught. The cold revealed what mattered: breath, touch, persistence. And so, Behind every wall of wattle and smoke, behind every whispering chimney and glowing stone, lived a silent vow to keep the flame alive, no matter the cost. They did not know that these same methods would one day vanish, replaced by machines and convenience. But perhaps that is why the memory lingers, because those forgotten fires were not merely about heat. They were about connection, about endurance woven into the quiet rhythm of life. In every ember, there was a story. In every flicker, a prayer. And in every lingering warmth, the ghost of a hand that once reached out to save another from the dark. In the deep quiet of winter, when the world lay sealed in ice and the soil no longer breathed, the act of eating became a small enchantment. Every crumb, every sip, was a spell of endurance. The medieval table was not a place of abundance, but of negotiation with nature's indifference. They did not feast to forget the cold. They ate to remind themselves that life still moved within them. And so, food became alchemy, transforming the raw and bitter into something that could sustain both flesh and hope. When the harvest was long gone, survival rested on what could be coaxed to last. In the dim corners of cottages, wooden barrels hid fermenting roots and vegetables. The air was heavy with the scent of salt, vinegar, and smoke. They learned to keep food not by defiance, but by transformation, turning decay itself into preservation. Cabbage became sharp and alive with fermentation. Meat darkened and toughened in smokehouses until it smelled faintly of earth and fire. Bread, once soft, was baked hard as stone, meant to be soaked in broth or wine before it could be chewed. Every meal was an act of patience, every flavor a reminder of what time could change. They called certain foods warming, believing they carried the sun's memory. Garlic, onions, mustard seed, simple ingredients, thought to ignite inner fire. Herbal lore was passed in whispers from mother to daughter. Add crushed sage to broth for courage, thyme for strength, marjoram for calm. These were not recipes but invocations, instructions for feeding the spirit as much as the body. When sickness came, they boiled honey and vinegar, creating potions that soothed the throat and silenced the fear that death might enter through hunger. The poor depended on what the land reluctantly gave. Roots pulled from frozen soil, dried beans softened in cold water, bones boiled until they surrendered their marrow. Yet even this poverty carried ritual. Before the pot was stirred, someone would trace a cross in the steam, offering gratitude not to plenty, but to persistence. The smell of soup became a kind of prayer, the promise that warmth could still be summoned from emptiness. For the monks, winter fasting revealed a different alchemy. They saw hunger as a doorway to vision, a thinning of the veil between body and soul. In their kitchens, small miracles were recorded, broth that seemed to multiply, bread that never fully disappeared. They spoke of divine sustenance, of being fed by faith. But behind the holiness lay clever adaptation. Monks brewed strong ale rich with barley and herbs, calling it liquid bread. It filled the stomach and blurred the line between need and devotion. Some abbeys even grew secret winter gardens under glass panes or inside cloisters warmed by candles, cultivating small green leaves long after snow buried the world outside. Trade routes brought strange treasures that felt almost forbidden spices from distant lands carried in rough sacks. Cinnamon, pepper, nutmeg. These were more than luxuries. They were symbols of the world beyond the frost. To sprinkle a little spice into porridge was to taste sunlight from another place. The church frowned on indulgence, but even priests were not immune to the temptation of warmth on the tongue. It was said that one bishop kept a pouch of cinnamon hidden beneath his robe, using it only when the nights turned cruelly long. In the silence between meals, hunger changed thought. It slowed the mind, made dreams vivid. Villagers swore that fasting sharpened their senses, that they could hear snow falling miles away. Some said that hunger was a kind of awakening, that it stripped away the noise of appetite until only truth remained. A few even claimed to see lights dancing above the fields, flickering like invisible fires. The church dismissed these visions as madness, but still the stories spread from farmhouse to tavern, from monk to traveller. The cold had a way of peeling back reason and revealing something older beneath. Not all food was meant to nourish. Some was meant to deceive. Peasants crafted mock feasts from whatever they could find. Parsnips carved to look like fish, dark rye bread shaped into roasted meat. They laughed as they ate, the humour warming them better than the food itself. It was defiance disguised as joy. These meals became legend, the night when the poor dined like kings in imagination alone. The cold could steal their comfort, but not their play. Yet even in scarcity, generosity survived. When a traveller knocked at a door, a bowl was shared. To refuse food to the hungry was to invite a curse, for in the stories told by firelight, strangers were often angels in disguise. A crust of bread, a spoon of stew, a place near the hearth, these gestures stitched a fragile web of trust through the frozen months. In giving, they believed, warmth multiplied. Every flavour told a story of distance and endurance. Salt from forgotten coasts, herbs from summer fields, smoke from the same wood that built their homes. The taste of food was the taste of memory, of all that had come before the frost, and in this they found comfort, that what sustained them was not the food alone, but the continuity of hands that prepared it. When the pot finally emptied, when only a thin line of broth clung to its rim, they did not despair. They scraped it clean, with the same reverence given to relics. Nothing wasted, nothing lost. The alchemy was complete. Hunger turned to gratitude, scarcity to ritual, survival to faith. To eat was to believe in another day. To swallow warmth was to trust that the world, despite its silence, still cared to keep them alive. And as the last spoon fell quiet against the bowl, the question remained, what did hunger teach them that fullness never could? The answer waited, hidden in the body itself, where endurance had written its secret language beneath the skin. Hunger was not just an emptiness in the stomach. It was a presence, a soft shadow that followed each person through the long winter months. At first, it whispered gently a skipped meal here, a tightened belt there, but as the night stretched on, its voice grew clearer, more insistent. It crept into dreams, reshaping them into visions of feasts that would never come. In the faint light of the hearth, the hungry spoke less and listened more, as if the silence itself were feeding them something unseen. When the body began to weaken, the mind awoke in strange ways. The monks said that fasting stripped away the fog of the world, that in deprivation the divine could be heard more clearly. For peasants, hunger was not chosen, but its effects were eerily similar. They saw things more sharply, the glint of frost on a nail, the shimmer of moonlight on snow. Some began to sense patterns in the cold air, threads of meaning woven through the landscape. The pain of hunger turned perception into prayer. There were stories of people who, after days without food, spoke to the dead. They claimed to hear familiar voices in the crackle of the fire, or to see faint figures reflected in the ice outside their doors. Others said they saw their ancestors standing in the corners of the room, silently watching them endure. These tales were whispered, not as superstition, but as truth earned through suffering. The cold opens the eyes of the soul, the old ones said, and few dared to argue. Monks wrote of holy lightness, a state where hunger made the body feel transparent. They would rise before dawn, bones aching, stomachs hollow, yet claimed to feel warmth radiating from nowhere. The more they fasted, the more they spoke of visions, rivers that flowed upward, stars that pulsed with breath, hands that reached out from the snow and dissolved into air. Whether these were divine revelations or the mind's desperate tricks, none could tell. But they gave meaning to the ache, and meaning kept people alive. In villages, hunger was shared like everything else. No one spoke of it openly, yet every glance across the table told the truth. When food ran out, they turned to ritual. A single onion cut into 7 slices, one for each day until the next market. A piece of bread placed on the window ledge for the unseen guest. The gestures were small but powerful, the acknowledgement that life was more than the body's craving. They believed that generosity, even in famine, confused the spirits of hunger and kept the soul from hardening. There was a strange beauty in their restraint. When appetite could not be fed, imagination did the work instead. They spoke of summer fruits until they could taste them, described roasted meat so vividly that mouths watered despite the emptiness. Words became sustenance. In these long nights, storytelling was nourishment, the retelling of feasts past, of miracles where food had appeared from nowhere. They weren't merely distracting themselves, they were keeping memory alive, feeding on hope when nothing else remained. Sometimes, the line between starvation and sanctity blurred completely. In the coldest regions, legends told of winter sleepers, people who seemed to fall into deep rest when food was gone, waking months later when the thaw arrived. Some believed these were blessed souls, protected by divine mercy. Others said they had become part of the earth, borrowing its slow rhythm until warmth returned. Modern eyes might call it survival instinct, but to them, it was holy surrender. Among the devout, the concept of fasting carried another layer of mystery. They believed that when the stomach was empty, the heart could speak. The absence of food made room for revelation. Some claimed to feel their thoughts sharpen into a single point of light, piercing through the veil between worlds. Others described a sense of vast stillness, as though they had stepped outside time itself. These moments were fleeting but unforgettable, echoing long after the first meal broke the spell. Yet hunger also revealed cruelty. Those with stores locked them tight, fearing desperate neighbors more than the cold. There were nights when doors stayed shut, and the sound of pleading faded into the wind. But even then, guilt lingered. The cold had a way of equalizing memory. No one could forget the face of someone they refused. In that guilt grew compassion, the fragile understanding that survival meant nothing if it left the soul frozen. Eventually, the first signs of spring would appear: a bird's call, a drip of water from a thawing roof, and people would rise from their long deprivation, lighter, slower, changed. The first bite of fresh food after hunger was almost unbearable in its joy. Some wept, unable to chew. They said it tasted not of earth, but of forgiveness. Eating again was not simply nourishment, it was reunion with the body, with the world, with the faith that endurance had been worth it. But hunger left its mark. Even after the table was full, the memory remained a hollow space beneath the ribs, a quiet that echoed when the wind rose at night. It reminded them of what they had survived, and what the cold had taught, that life's fire was never guaranteed, and that the soul could burn even when the stomach was empty. The monks wrote that the truly wise did not seek to banish hunger, but to understand it. It was, they said, the oldest teacher, the voice of the body reminding the spirit of its dependence and of its strength. Through hunger, they believed, one learned to see the invisible, the thin line between life and nothingness, between pain and revelation. And perhaps that is why, even now, the echo of that lesson remains. In every fast, every craving, every quiet ache that draws us inward, something ancient stirs the memory of those who once found holiness in the hollow and warmth in the absence of all warmth. The cold may have passed, but the hunger still whispers. And in that whisper lies the oldest secret of survival. Long before compasses and forecasts, before maps marked the borders of the known, people learned to listen to winter itself. Snow was not just a silence that fell, it was a language, whispered in patterns too delicate for most to hear. To those who lived closest to the earth, each flake carried meaning. They studied its weight, its shape, the way it landed or refused to settle. They believed snow was alive, that it spoke in the pauses between storms, and that if you paid attention, you could hear what it was trying to say. In the deep countryside, when the first snow began to fall, no one moved quickly. The villagers stood outside their doors and watched the air thicken, sensing whether the storm would be kind or cruel. The texture of the flakes foretold its mood. Soft and round meant calm, sharp and dry, danger. Children were taught to listen for what they called snow's breath, the faint hiss that came when flakes fell on frozen ground. It was a warning that the earth beneath had sealed itself shut, that nothing living should be buried now. The snow gave signs in its sound. A light fall made the world hum softly, almost tenderly, but a heavy one pressed the air so thick that every noise vanished. The old hunters said they could track prey by listening, not looking. The crunch of snow underfoot changed with each hour of frost, soft in new snow, brittle after a clear night, hollow when ice formed beneath. To step wrong was to betray yourself. In this frozen language, silence could mean safety or death. They also read the sky. The color of clouds told them how the snow would behave. A pale green before dusk warned of freezing rain. A deep violet at dawn foretold days of still, biting cold. Monks kept small journals of these observations, marking the rhythms of the frost like sacred text. To them, snow was divine handwriting, proof that nature itself recorded the passage of time. They wrote of white scripture, where the world became a blank page each winter, erased and rewritten by the wind. At night, when the moon rose over the frozen land, the snow turned luminous. Paths that were invisible by day glowed faintly, guiding travelers home. Some believed this light was the reflection of souls who had perished in earlier winters, returning to show the living the way. Others called it the Earth's lantern, a gift for those brave enough to walk after dark. People trusted this glow as they would a prayer, stepping carefully through the silver hush, their breath visible in the air like short-lived smoke. Even the way snow melted held significance. Rapid thawing was seen as impatience, a sign that spring had not been earned. Slow melting was a blessing. It nourished the soil without flooding it. Villagers would touch the dripping edges of roofs, feeling the rhythm of the melt, as though listening to the heartbeat of the season. When icicles broke on their own, it meant winter had released its grip. When they hung on stubbornly, it meant more hardship to come. Animals, too, joined the conversation. The direction a fox crossed a field, the pattern of a bird's flight over snow, the sudden quiet of wolves, all were messages. People learned to interpret them as surely as words. The world speaks, they said, but only in winter does it speak clearly. The rest of the year was too loud: rain, harvest, laughter. Only in cold silence could truth be heard. There were those who claimed to dream in snow. They would wake and know when a storm was coming, or where a lost traveller had fallen. These dreamers were not feared but respected. Villagers sent them to read the fields before hunts or journeys. They said the dreamers could feel the mood of the frost, could sense whether the season would kill or spare. Some monks believed these visions were remnants of an older, purer communication between man and nature, a connection dulled by the comforts of fire and faith. Snow shaped their stories as much as their survival. Tales told around the hearth often began with it: a lost child following strange footprints that vanished, a woman who disappeared into the white and returned with her hair turned silver. Snow was the threshold between worlds, above it the living, beneath it the quiet dead. When a storm erased all signs of the road, they said it was winter resetting the world, erasing mistakes too heavy to bear. But beyond fear and awe, there was affection. They loved the way snow softened the harshness of life. Broken fences, rough fields, even graves, everything looked forgiven under its blanket. It muffled anger, silenced regret. The poor found dignity in it, for under snow, every home appeared equal. It made the world clean again, at least for a while. As the season deepened, the people began to speak less and observe more. Words were unnecessary when the air itself spoke. They measured distance, not by miles, but by the rhythm of their steps through drifts. The wind sculpted shapes on the hills that looked like sleeping giants, and they treated these forms as guardians. The more they looked, the more they felt watched not by menace, but by presence. Winter was not absence, it was attention. They knew that to rush through snow was to miss its teaching. Every fall had its own character, every thaw its own voice. In that listening, they found calm, a surrender to something larger than will. Modern minds might call it superstition, but perhaps it was something else: awareness, patience, reverence. They did not separate observation from faith, for both required the same thing: silence. And so they endured, guided not by maps or saints, but by the whisper of snow beneath their boots. It told them when to rest, when to hunt, when to hope. Each winter renewed the dialogue between man and earth, a conversation written in frost and erased by the first rain. They knew that if they listened closely enough, they might even hear the snow answering their prayers. And perhaps, somewhere in that white hush, the next secret of survival was already waiting to be found. The world they built was not meant to conquer the cold, but to speak with it. Every wall, every roof, every seam between stone and straw was a quiet reply to the wind's demands. Their houses were not barriers, they were instruments tuned to the rhythm of frost and thaw. They listened to the language of snow and shaped their homes to echo it, not resist it. In the low valleys, cottages crouched close to the ground, huddled like animals conserving heat. Their walls were made of wattle and daub, woven branches packed with mud and straw, light enough to breathe, dense enough to hold warmth. The roofs sagged under thatch thick as blankets, sloping low so snow would slide slowly, not fall. When storms buried the village, the homes seemed to disappear entirely, leaving only the faint outlines of chimneys exhaling thin columns of steam. From a distance, it looked as though the earth itself had learned to breathe. Inside, the air was alive. The walls, damp and imperfect, absorbed moisture during the day and released it at night, creating a slow pulse of humidity that kept frost from forming on the beams. The smell was of wood smoke and soil, of something living, Families learned the subtle art of balance: open a shutter too long, and the cold stole the room; close it too tight, and the air turned heavy; sleep thick with dizziness. Each home was a living body, and its inhabitants knew how to read its pulse. In colder regions, they built with stone, not for strength but for memory. Stone gathered the day's brief warmth and held it close, releasing it in the small hours when even fire hesitated. Builders placed the hearth in the center, the way a heart sits in the chest, and arranged sleeping spaces around it. Heat flowed outward like blood, gentle and slow. The poorest homes, barely more than caves, used the same principle. They carved niches into rock, lined them with straw, and let the mountain cradle them. Snow itself became part of the architecture. In heavy winters, villagers packed it against the outer walls, sealing gaps and muffling sound. What seemed an enemy turned to ally. Snow insulated better than any brick. Some even built temporary domes, rounded huts of snow and straw, where animals and people shared warmth. The breath of beasts rose into the rafters, condensing as frost that glittered like stars. They said these roofs were blessed by breath, proof that life could be its own form of fire. Even the floors spoke to the cold. Many were layered with rushes. Dried grasses replaced each season. Beneath them, a hidden warmth accumulated, the slow decay of plants releasing heat too faint to see but enough to notice. Walk barefoot across such a floor, and it felt alive. Monks who recorded these practices called it the kindness of rot. They did not understand the science, only that it worked, and that nature never truly slept, even in snow. Some builders went further. They designed small vents near the hearths that guided smoke through winding paths before letting it escape. As the smoke moved, it warmed the walls, leaving a black sheen of soot that repelled moisture. Villagers believed the soot itself had protective power, that a blackened wall was proof of a home that had survived many winters. In time, even that superstition carried wisdom. Soot sealed the cracks, and the homes grew stronger. Windows were rare, and when they existed, they were not glass but stretched parchment or thin sheets of horn. These soft windows glowed like honey when firelight touched them, casting an amber warmth into the room. They blurred the edges of the outside world, making the cold look distant and unreal. People sat beneath that golden haze, listening to the storm beyond, feeling safe inside their small illusion of sunlight. The architecture of survival was an art of compromise. Nothing wasted, nothing rigid. Roofs could be patched with reeds, walls thickened with clay from a nearby stream. Each improvement was tested by the next storm, and every failure became a lesson. They knew that perfection was impossible, only adaptation endured. "Build as the wind teaches," one proverb said, "and your home will remember how to stand." There were larger structures too, barns that doubled as refuge, churches whose thick walls held heat for days. In some monasteries, corridors were built underground, connecting kitchens to chapels, so monks could move through warmth without braving the open snow. The air in those tunnels was strange, damp and echoing, filled with the faint smell of earth. Walking through them felt like passing through the body of the world itself. Those who labored there believed the tunnels were sacred, that the warmth beneath the frost was proof of God's mercy hidden below suffering. But perhaps the most remarkable designs were those that vanished entirely in winter. Herders in the far north built seasonal shelters meant to collapse under snow, forming natural domes that insulated them better than wood. In spring, they melted away, leaving no trace. This architecture had no pride, only purpose. It reminded people that endurance was not about standing tall, but knowing when to yield. When storms cleared and sunlight returned, these homes looked modest, almost fragile. Yet they had survived when stronger walls cracked. Their secret was humility, the willingness to let nature lead. Modern eyes might see only poverty in those structures, but the villagers saw partnership. The world gave cold, and they replied with craft. The exchange was fair. Even now, buried beneath centuries of progress, echoes of that wisdom remain. The warmth trapped in a well-built stone wall, the draught that slips kindly through an old window. These are remnants of a forgotten conversation. Architecture has grown louder, sharper, more certain. But somewhere in the silence of winter nights, the old houses still whisper, reminding us that to build is to listen. And if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear it, the sigh of walls breathing, the snow shifting on the roof, the gentle promise that even in the coldest darkness, something has learned how to endure. The next lesson lay not within stone or straw, but within the body itself, the living architecture of flesh and blood, built to survive the frost. The body has its own memory, one that whispers beneath thought, older than language, older even than fear. In the long medieval winters, it was the body, not the mind, that first learned how to survive. When the frost came, flesh obeyed an instinct no prayer could teach. Blood slowed, skin thickened, and breath became shallow to conserve heat. Each heartbeat seemed to echo the season's rhythm, a slow percussion against silence. People did not speak of this as adaptation. They called it endurance, a quiet surrender to the cold that felt both inevitable and divine. They noticed how their bodies changed with the months. By the end of autumn, faces grew ruddier, fingers rougher, the smell of wood smoke clinging permanently to hair and clothes. They ate differently, moved differently. The strongest men, who worked the fields bare-armed in summer, carried smaller loads when snow came. The body's energy turned inward, protecting what was vital. In the stillness of winter, they slept longer, rose slower, and breathed deeper, as if sharing the earth's hibernation. Old healers said that winter blood was heavier, that it flowed like honey through cold glass. To thin it too soon, they warned, was to invite weakness. They mixed warming drinks from herbs and wine, believing that fire could be coaxed to live inside the chest. The truth was simpler. They had observed how the pulse thickened when the cold deepened, how even wounds bled slower. Their wisdom came not from books, but from the quiet precision of noticing. In monasteries, fasting monks recorded the strange sensations of the body under cold. Some wrote that they could feel their hearts move differently, slower but stronger, like a drum buried under snow. They took this as proof that suffering purified not just the soul but the blood itself. It was said that to endure winter without complaint was to align oneself with the rhythm of creation. The body, one monk wrote, is a candle learning not to fear its own flame. But survival required more than patience. People learned tricks so subtle they seemed instinctive. They rubbed snow on their skin to stimulate warmth, slept with stones heated in the fire, or wore layers of wool greased with animal fat to trap body heat. Shepherds wrapped their feet in straw before pulling on boots, the rustle of grass a comfort against the night. Hunters, out for days in the open, learned to breathe through scarves so their lungs would not freeze. These were not inventions, they were memories, passed from one generation of bodies to the next. The cold demanded cooperation. No one survived alone. When temperatures fell too low for fires to fight, families pressed together in sleep, their collective warmth stronger than any hearth. They called it the winter knot. Infants were bound close to mothers, elders surrounded by children. The rhythm of shared breathing kept the frost at bay. In the morning, frost still crept along the walls, but their bodies had won another night's negotiation with death. There was beauty in their resilience, though they did not call it that. They did not romanticize the ache of frozen fingers or the sting of wind that split their skin. But they understood something we have forgotten, that pain was not only a warning, but a teacher. Frostbite showed where the body's borders lay, where the spirit must learn humility. The first numbness of the skin reminded them that life was always precarious, always conditional. And yet, they continued to wake each day, trusting the flesh to remember what the mind might forget. They believed that the cold revealed character. A strong body could withstand frost, but a strong heart could outlast despair. When illness came, it struck hardest in those who lost the will to fight. So they trained themselves not only in endurance but in calm. Stillness keeps warmth, the elders said, and they were right. Fear wasted heat, rage burned it too fast. The survivors were those who could breathe slowly in the dark, who met the cold with quiet rather than panic. Travelers spoke of a strange transformation that overtook those who lived many winters in the far north. Their skin paled until it almost glowed blue in moonlight. Their eyes adjusted to dimness. Their breath became invisible even in the deepest cold. The villagers said they were claimed by winter, that the season had written its language into their blood. Some of these people seemed untouched by frost, able to work bare-handed while others shivered. Modern words might call it adaptation, but in their time, it was seen as blessing. The body, they believed, had made peace with the cold. Within monasteries, healers practiced small experiments, warming hands over fire, plunging them into snow, observing how long it took for color to return. They recorded the tingling sensation as the dance of heat, proof that the soul re-entered the flesh after exile. From such simple observations grew a philosophy that suffering, endured without resistance, transformed not only the body but the heart. The cold, one abbot wrote, is the world reminding us that breath itself is a miracle. There was a quiet pride in this intimacy with pain. To survive winter was not a triumph over nature, but a dialogue with it. The body spoke in shivers and pulses, and the earth answered with frost and thaw. They did not need to understand this language fully. It was enough to trust it. When warmth returned each spring, they marveled at their own endurance, not with arrogance, but with awe. They had carried life through the season of stillness, guided by instincts buried deep in their blood. Centuries later, we still inherit that memory. The way our fingers curl when cold, the way breath slows in frost, the way silence feels heavier in winter nights, all remnants of that ancient conversation. Beneath every modern coat, every flick of a heater, something older still stirs. The body remembering what it once knew, what it still knows, that survival is not a victory but a vow. And as the last embers fade, that vow continues, breathing through generations. For even now, when the cold presses against the glass, our blood remembers the rhythm of those long-forgotten nights, the slow, patient heartbeat of endurance that once kept the world alive. The next warmth would not come from fire or flesh, but from the unseen connection between hearts, the invisible heat of community that burned brighter than any flame. When the nights grew too long for the hearth to hold its warmth, people turned to another kind of fire, the one that lived in their voices. Speech, laughter, song, these were the coals that never went out. In the deep silence of winter, when even the trees seemed to sleep, the sound of human voices carried a different weight. It filled the air like smoke, rising into the rafters, wrapping around those who listened. The cold could creep into their bones, but it could not survive where words still moved. Gathering was instinct, not habit. As dusk fell, neighbors crossed snowfields toward the largest hut, guided by the faint amber glow of a hearth. They came not for warmth alone, but for company, the kind that kept the mind from freezing. Boots stamped snow from thresholds, cloaks hung dripping by the door. Inside, the air pulsed with low voices and the sweet scent of smoke. They sat close, knees nearly touching, the sound of breath mingling until it became a single living rhythm. It was here that stories began, slow at first, like the hesitant crackle of fresh wood. The storyteller's task was sacred. To speak in winter was to guard against forgetting. Each tale was a thread tying them to those who had endured before. They told of saints who wandered through snow without dying, of lovers separated by frost who found each other when the rivers melted, of wolves that spoke in the language of dreams. Listeners leaned forward, the glow of the fire painting their faces gold. In those moments, time loosened its grip. The past and present folded together, bound by the voice that refused to go silent. Even the simplest songs carried warmth. A single note could travel farther than the light of a candle. Children learned lullabies that their grandparents had sung, tunes older than memory itself. They did not understand the words, many were in dialects already fading, but the melody held meaning. It was the sound of belonging, of proof that they were not alone in the dark. And so, they sang softly through the long nights, weaving harmony into the stillness. The echoes lingered even after sleep claimed them, as though the air itself remembered the tune. In monasteries, the rhythm of chant served the same purpose. Voices rose together in cold stone halls, echoing against arches rimed with frost. The sound was steady, measured a pulse that reminded them of the divine heartbeat. When breath turned to mist in the candlelight, they imagined it as prayer made visible. For a few moments each dawn, as the chant reached its quiet peak, even the cold seemed to hesitate, listening. Some monks swore they could feel the temperature rise slightly, though perhaps it was only the warmth of shared breath. Words themselves were considered a kind of heat. To speak unkindly in winter was forbidden. Curses were believed to draw frost closer. Kind words, however small, were thought to soften the air. When quarrels arose, elders intervened quickly. "Do not waste your fire," they would say, meaning, "Do not spend your warmth on anger." To speak gently was to survive together. Each conversation was an exchange of energy, invisible but vital. Laughter, too, had power. It startled the darkness. It made the snow outside seem less vast. When someone laughed loudly enough, others swore the walls shook slightly, the sound pushing back the cold. They said the devil of winter hated joy most of all, because it reminded him of the sun. In the poorest cottages, where the fire burned weak and the wind hissed through every seam, laughter often became the only defense left. It was defiance, disguised as delight. There was a custom, half prayer and half play, known as telling the fire. Each person took turns speaking to the flames, as though to an old friend, confessions, wishes, fragments of memory. The fire crackled in reply, and everyone listened as though it understood. The ritual was said to keep bad dreams away, to keep the house from feeling empty. More than that, it turned silence into participation. Even those too tired to speak found comfort in watching others release their words into the smoke. Children listened wide-eyed, absorbing every sound. They learned to measure a night's safety not by the strength of the fire, but by the number of voices still murmuring. When the talking stopped, the cold crept in. And so, even as exhaustion pulled at them, someone would begin another story, or hum softly, or recite a psalm until dawn, hinted at the window. The sound was a spell that bridged one night to the next. In larger towns, the same instinct shaped community. Taverns became sanctuaries, not for drink alone, but for connection. Music echoed from wooden walls, flutes and fiddles lifting spirits against the weight of winter. Strangers shared benches and songs, temporary warmth found in shared melody. Outside, snow swallowed every sound, but within those crowded rooms, the air vibrated with life. When spring finally came, the villagers said they could still feel the echo of those gatherings inside them, a warmth that outlasted fire. It was as if the voice had become its own kind of body heat, stored deep in memory. Even years later, when an old story resurfaced or a familiar song was hummed, they would feel that warmth again, faint but unmistakable. The body could remember the cold, but it also remembered the warmth that words created. It carried those nights forward, hidden beneath the skin. Long after the snow melted and fields greened, the pulse of communal sound remained, a second heartbeat whispering, "You are not alone. You were never alone." In that realization lay the truest survival, not the warmth of flame or flesh, but of shared sound. For as long as they could speak, they could endure. And beyond the sound of voices waited something deeper, still the hush that followed them into the dark, the sacred silence where even speech gave way to reverence. Night in the medieval world arrived, not as absence, but as revelation. When the sun withdrew, another kind of life began, quiet, deliberate, full of listening. The dark was not simply what remained when light faded. It was its own presence, thick and breathing. Candles sputtered, shadows stretched, and the familiar world changed shape. Those who lived through these hours did not fear the night entirely. They revered it, for in the stillness they felt closest to mystery, to the divine, to themselves. When the last ember dimmed, everything slowed. The air cooled, the floor creaked under settling beams, and outside, the fields dissolved into endless black. In towns, church bells marked the boundaries of waking life after the last toll. Speech softened, and even dogs fell silent. Monks called it times the hour of listening *, when souls could hear what daylight drowned out. For peasants, it was the hour of waiting between exhaustion and sleep, between prayer and dream. Time loosened, measured not in hours but in the distance between breaths. Darkness carried both blessing and unease. The faithful spoke of it as God's cloak, a cover for contemplation, but others believed it hid older spirits, the ones driven from daylight when the first churches rose. To them, night was a borderland, neither safe nor hostile, simply honest. It revealed what light disguised, the crack in a wall, the whisper of wind under the door, the heartbeat of the world beneath the noise. Some said you could feel the planet itself breathing if you stood still long enough. Sleep came differently then. It did not sweep in all at once, but in two waves. People called the first sleep, a heavy, dreamless rest. They woke sometime after midnight, eyes adjusting to the faint glimmer of embers, bodies half warm, half cold. These hours between sleeps were sacred. Couples whispered confessions, mothers fed infants, monks prayed in dark chapels where the wax of candles melted like slow tears. It was the in-between time, the gate between worlds. Then, quietly, They drifted into second sleep, deeper and filled with visions. In that waking interval, thoughts carried unusual clarity. Some claimed to receive messages in the stillness, answers to prayers, warnings of storms, sudden understandings that vanished by dawn. Even those who scoffed at prophecy admitted that something changed in the mind at that hour. The dark seemed to sharpen the edges of thought. It was said that truth preferred to speak in whispers, and night was the only time the world could hear it. To walk outside after midnight was to enter another realm. Snow reflected starlight so faintly that every footstep glowed. Trees appeared frozen in mid-breath, their branches silvered with frost. Travellers wrapped in wool felt as though they were moving through a dream painted in shades of silence. The air bit the lungs, but there was a strange pleasure in it, a purity untouched by smoke or sound. They believed the night carried secrets of creation, that somewhere above, beyond the stars, the first word of the world was still being spoken. In monasteries, the nocturnal offices began at these hours. Bells rang through corridors, calling the brothers from straw pallets. Bare feet shuffled across stone. The chants that followed were not loud. They were measured murmurs rising into arches unseen. Outside, frost covered the cloisters, but inside, voices warmed the air. The monks believed that by singing in darkness, they joined creation in its most hidden state. God, they said, worked best unseen. For ordinary folk, the night's holiness was less formal, but no less deep. They told stories in hushed tones, believing that loud words might wake spirits wandering nearby. Firelight danced on their faces, each flicker carving new expressions, sometimes calm, sometimes fearful. They spoke of willow, the wisps that led travellers astray, of dead kings riding across the sky, of dreams that foretold both death and love. The telling itself was comfort, proof that even in the vast black, voices still met one another. Not all darkness was benign. Shadows gathered meanings of their own. The space behind the door, the corner of the barn, the forest line beyond the fields, each held potential for something unseen. Yet the people did not chase these fears away. They lived beside them, acknowledging their place in the order of things. To erase darkness entirely would be to offend the balance. Light blinds as well as guides, one proverb warned. The wise man learns when to see and when to close his eyes. There were nights when the wind itself seemed to speak. A soft whistle through a thatched roof, a moan between shutters, signs that the cold had come to visit. Some took these sounds as omens, others as conversation. They responded with murmured prayers, gentle words to the unseen. In this dialogue, fear became ritual, and ritual became peace. Children, before sleeping, were taught to thank the night for its silence. "It keeps secrets for us," mothers would whisper. The idea was simple yet profound, that the dark was not void, but keeper a vessel for dreams, grief, and wonder. To lie awake beneath its weight was to rest within something vast and protective. The medieval night was not an enemy to be lit away. It was an element, as vital as water or air. It reminded people of their scale, their fragility, their belonging. In it, they found humility, the understanding that life's brightest moments gleam only because the dark allows them. As dawn approached, the world softened again. Shadows thinned, outlines returned, and the pale blue of morning seeped into the cracks of the room. The first bird called, tentative, as if testing whether it was safe to speak. For those who had kept vigil, the coming of light felt less like relief and more like interruption. The sacred hours had ended, leaving only memory a quiet afterglow of revelation. They believed that nightfall was not the closing of the day, but the opening of the soul. And perhaps, in that belief, they were right. For in the dark, they learned that not all illumination burns. And beyond that quiet revelation waited the sky itself, the endless cathedral of stars that guided the sleepless through the frozen hours. When eyes finally adjusted to the depth of night, the heavens revealed themselves slowly, reverently, as if reluctant to be seen. The medieval sky was not empty space. It was a map of intentions. Stars were not distant fires but messengers, each one a glint of something purposeful. To look upward was to remember that warmth and guidance could come from far beyond reach. Under that vast breathing darkness, every flicker of light became a promise that even winter had not conquered everything. For those who travelled by night, the stars were companions. Roads vanished under snow, rivers froze without sound. But the constellations never shifted their positions. The North Star, bright and still, was the faithful one fixed when all else wandered. Shepherds, merchants and pilgrims lifted their eyes to it, whispering small prayers before setting out. They said the star answered, not in words, but in calm. A steady heart could always find its way when that light was visible. Yet the stars were not only guides of direction, they were guides of time. Monks charted their rising and setting with careful ink, tracing the seasons through patterns above the cloister roof. They marked holy days by where certain constellations stood, believing heaven itself kept the world's calendar. When storms hid the sky, unease spread through the abbey. It was as if the clock of creation had stopped ticking. Among villagers, knowledge of the stars was less formal but deeply felt. They recognized certain clusters not by Greek names but by the shapes they suggested: the plough, the hunter, the sleeping child. Stories accompanied them, whispered beside the fire to children who stared up from doorways. These tales carried warmth across generations, proof that even in darkness, imagination could keep the world alive. Some believed the stars were holes in a great curtain, letting the light of paradise leak through. Others said they were the souls of the righteous, watching over the frozen earth with patient concern. The moon, however, was the truest companion of winter. Its cold glow traced silver paths across snow and water, transforming night into a landscape of reflection. People timed their labours by it, the cutting of wood, the brewing of ale, the long journeys between villages. A full moon meant movement, a dark one meant stay and wait. The rhythm of moonlight was the pulse of their world. When the moon waned, anxiety stirred. Without its glow, shadows grew thick enough to imagine shapes within them. The relationship between heaven and earth felt personal. To the medieval mind, stars were not in different bodies, they looked back. Each twinkle was a sign of attention, proof that the vastness above cared enough to shimmer for those below. Lovers swore vows under them, believing the stars bore witness. Widows spoke to them as to their departed, sending words upward like smoke. "They can hear if you mean it," an old saying went. Meaning, not volume, carried prayers across distance. Astrologers, half respected and half feared, read these lights as divine handwriting. Their charts filled with circles and symbols, translating the movement of fire into prophecy. The church condemned such practices, but quietly consulted them nonetheless. For all their denouncements, even bishops wished to know what the stars intended. Were the coming months to bring thaw or famine? Would war bloom like frost on the fields? Heaven, they believed, always knew first. Still, for most, the stars were not omens but comfort. To sit outside after the hearth went dim, wrapped in cloaks and silence, was to feel part of a pattern too large to name. The body's small warmth, the heart's slow rhythm, the breath turning to mist all mirrored the movements above. The cosmos, for them, was not distant but mirrored within. The same fire that burned in the stars lived, faintly, behind their ribs. There were songs about it, soft chants murmured at the edge of sleep. "As above, so below," one refrain said, long before the phrase found ink in occult texts. It was simply observation. The frost sparkled like stars on the ground. The stars glistened like frost in the sky. The same shimmer, two worlds reflecting one another. The people felt themselves suspended between them, halfway between heaven's fire and earth's ice. When travellers lost their way, they looked upward, trusting that the stars remembered paths even when memory failed. Sometimes clouds erased everything, leaving only blackness. Then they waited, patient, certain that the light would return. That faith was not superstition, it was survival. The ability to trust what could not yet be seen was its own warmth. The monks wrote that on the coldest nights, when the air was utterly still, the stars seemed closer. Some said they could hear them, a faint ringing, like the farthest echo of a bell. They called it times the harmony of creation, asterisk, a sound beyond human range, but felt in the bones. To stand beneath it was to remember that silence, too, had a pulse. In villages, the same awe took simpler form. Children lay on frozen ground, staring upward until their faces numbed, naming stars as if they were friends. Parents did not stop them. They believed the practice strengthened courage. "Learn their names," they told their children, "for someday they will guide you home." And when the sky shifted near dawn, when the first grey smudged the horizon, they felt both gratitude and loss. the stars withdrew like a curtain closing, leaving the world smaller again. The villagers turned homeward, knowing that daylight would bring noise and duty. But for a few hours each night, they had stood at the edge of infinity, warmed not by fire, but by wonder. Those who lived close to the heavens, hermits on mountains, sailors at sea, often described a moment when the sky seemed to lean down, touching the crown of the head. They said it left a tingle, a shiver that ran through every limb. "The stars remember us," one sailor wrote in a letter never sent, and that is enough. To the medieval soul, this celestial intimacy was proof of mercy. The heavens did not merely watch, they whispered back through light. Each winter, when life contracted to the small circle of firelight, the stars expanded the world again, reminding them of distance, yes, but also of connection. When they prayed, they looked upward not to escape the earth, but to see it from above. For them, the sky was a mirror of their endurance, a vast, cold beauty that could not extinguish its own light. And as the stars faded into morning, they knew the next journey would turn downward again, into the earth's hidden warmth beneath the frost, where secrets and shelter waited together. When winter turned merciless, the living world retreated underground. Beneath the silent snowfields, hidden doors led to a different realm, one of warmth, breath, and waiting. To the eye above, the land seemed abandoned, but below it pulsed quietly, like the slow heart of a sleeping creature. The people of the Middle Ages understood that survival required depth. Where the wind could not reach, life could begin again. The entrances were rarely marked. Sometimes they were disguised by brush or a mound of earth, sometimes by the floor of a barn. You had to know where to look. Those who built these hidden shelters called them times under houses, times or times winter burrows. Asterisk. They were carved from the soil itself, reinforced with timber or stone scavenged from ruins. Narrow tunnels led downward, twisting to trap warmth. Inside, the air was thick and still, faintly scented with clay and smoke. It was not comfort, but safety. Families gathered there when storms became unbearable. They brought only what could fit in a single armful: blankets, bread, the last piece of burning coal. Light came from oil lamps that hissed softly, halos of yellow flickering across rough walls. Shadows pressed close, yet the closeness was welcome. In the dimness, faces glowed, voices softened, and the howl of the blizzard above faded into a distant hum. The earth insulated sound. Even thunder became a low murmur, like the sky's heartbeat muffled by miles of soil. Some of these chambers had been there long before the people who used them. They found tunnels that predated memory passages carved with tools no one could name, symbols etched in stone that no priest could explain. The villagers claimed these were remnants of ancient beings, those who had lived through winters beyond reckoning. They called them the Old Sleepers. When peasants widened these spaces to use as shelters, they sometimes found bones, smooth and clean, curled in corners like people who had simply laid down to rest. None dared disturb them. The Old Sleepers were considered guardians, keeping the frost from finding its way inside. Monks, too, knew the underground's value. Beneath some abbeys ran corridors, connecting the living quarters to the cellars and crypts. During the hardest winters, the brothers moved their libraries below ground, where the temperature stayed constant and the manuscripts would not crack. Down there, they read by candlelight, while the world above froze silent. The thick air smelled of wax and dust, of centuries compressed. One chronicler wrote that the earth remembers what the wind forgets. In that quiet, the monks believed they could hear God more clearly, his voice rising from the depths rather than descending from the heavens. For travellers caught between villages, there were the caves. Shepherds and wanderers knew where to find them. In the folds of hills, behind curtains of ice, hidden near riverbeds. They carried small lamps and furs, sleeping among stalactites that glittered like frozen fire. These natural shelters had their own sounds, the dripping of melted frost, the faint echo of breath. Some swore that the caves whispered, repeating prayers or dreams in tones too low for waking ears. They believed the earth spoke slowly, answering those patient enough to listen. Every shelter had its rules. Fires were kept small. Too much smoke would suffocate. Voices stayed quiet. Echoing sound was said to attract spirits of the frost. Food was rationed in ritual, one bite per turn, one sip for each heartbeat. When someone fell asleep, the others watched, checking that the chest still rose. Death came quietly underground, without drama, and the living learned to accept it without fear. To die in the earth was to return home. There were darker uses too. Outlaws and heretics hid in these depths, entire communities that slipped beneath the surface when persecution swept through the land. Some built labyrinths that stretched for miles, lined with niches for candles and prayers. The church called them blasphemers, others called them visionaries. They worshipped in silence, believing the deeper they went, the closer they came to truth. To them, the cold above was the punishment of a world that had forgotten humility. Even centuries later, when farmers stumbled upon collapsed tunnels, they would pause before entering. The air from within came out warm, smelling of iron and stone, as if it had never known sunlight. In some places, fragments of pottery or tools still lay scattered. There were even rumors of strange carvings, faces with closed eyes, hands pressed to lips in gestures of eternal quiet. Archaeologists call them idols. The villagers called them warnings. Some secrets, they said, were meant to stay beneath the frost. Yet the underground was not merely a refuge from fear. It was also a teacher. Within those walls of earth, people learned what it meant to share breath, to trust silence, to measure time not by light but by heartbeat. They discovered that the deeper they went, the more life revealed itself in stillness, the warmth of skin against soil, the drip of water like a clock, the pulse in the wrist reminding them that even in darkness, they were not forgotten. The shelters were temporary, but their memory endured. Even after spring, thawed the ground and doors opened to the light. People remembered the feeling of safety buried in the earth. The underground stayed in them, a quiet reassurance that when the world above turned cruel, the world below would cradle them again. The monks wrote that hell was beneath the earth, but those who had lived through real winters disagreed. They said salvation lay there instead, hidden in clay and stone, waiting for the desperate to find it. Perhaps they were both right. The depths could destroy, but they could also preserve. Fire dies quickly in the open, but beneath the frost, an ember can last until morning. And as the last storms faded and the snow began to soften, people climbed back to the surface, carrying something unseen. The stillness of the underground, the wisdom of endurance, and a reverence for what sleeps quietly below. For under the frost, life does not end. It waits. And when it rises, it brings with it the memory of every whisper ever spoken in the dark. Stories grew out of the darkness below the frost. When people returned to their homes after long nights underground, they carried with them the silence of the earth, and that silence had a shape. It became the faces they thought they had seen in the shadows, the sighs that echoed when no one moved, the warmth that lingered after the fire had died. Out of these traces came the spirits of deep winter guardians, ghosts, and echoes that blurred the line between mercy and warning. Children were told that the sleepers still lived in the soil, walking beneath their feet when snow fell. Their steps made the ground tremble faintly before a storm. If you heard them, you were to remain still and whisper thanks, for they were keeping the frost from climbing higher. Farmers left crusts of bread at cracks in the earth, offerings for those unseen hands. No one admitted to believing such things, yet the gifts were never forgotten. Fear and gratitude grew from the same root. In some valleys, there were tales of the Frost Mother, a pale figure who wandered through buried tunnels, carrying a lamp that never burned out. She was said to appear to those near death, placing her cold hand on their brow to ease their pain. People feared her, but also longed for her mercy. She was not the bringer of death, but the one who guided it gently. In times of famine, when the very old refused food so the young might live, they whispered that the Frost Mother had already touched them. Miners and charcoal burners, who worked closest to the underworld, spoke of whispering walls. When they carved too deep, the earth itself groaned, warning them to stop. Those who ignored the sound often vanished, buried by collapses that seemed deliberate. The survivors claimed to hear the lost voices calling afterward, woven into the wind that rose through cracks in the stone. To quiet the voices, they left a candle burning in the abandoned shafts, a small sun to soothe whatever waited there. In monasteries, where theology met the raw unknown, such tales were copied into margins of manuscripts. One monk wrote of lights that wander beneath the snow, like stars that forgot their sky. He described visions seen during vigils, figures wrapped in frost, kneeling as if in prayer. The church dismissed these as temptations, tricks of tired minds, but some abbots quietly confessed that they too had seen something move in the corners of their chapels on bitter nights. The darkness beneath their holy floors was never entirely empty. The villagers did not see these presences as evil. They believed the spirits reminded them of the balance between life and stillness. The underground was a place of waiting. Everything that went there, seeds, the dead, the sleeping, eventually rose again. During the thaw, people gathered around the first cracks in the ice and poured wine into them to wake the sleepers gently. They said that if you looked closely into the meltwater, you could see faint shapes moving, as if the ground itself exhaled its dreams. Not all spirits were kind. Some legends spoke of the hollow men figures of mist that drifted through the fields at night, drawn to the warmth of homes built over forgotten tunnels. They carried no faces, only outlines, and when they passed, frost bloomed on window glass in the shape of hands. To ward them off, villagers painted circles of soot above their doors. The soot, they said, came from fire that had never seen daylight, the purest defense against the cold's envy. Yet even these fears served a purpose. They kept people close to the fire, close to one another. The stories were instructions disguised as wonder. Don't wander alone after nightfall. Keep embers alive. Respect what sleeps beneath you. Each legend was a survival manual written in poetry. The children who listened wide-eyed by the hearth might not remember every word, but they remembered how it felt, the mixture of terror and safety that defined life through winter. Sometimes, travelers spoke of hearing music under the frozen ground. On the stillest nights, they claimed the earth itself hummed a low, endless tone that matched the rhythm of their hearts. Some said it was the wind trapped in tunnels, others swore it was the singing of the sleepers. Those who heard it never forgot the sound. It haunted them, but not unpleasantly. It was the memory of belonging, proof that life continued unseen. The strangest tales were of the warm places, pockets of air found deep in the soil where the frost never reached. Shepherds stumbled upon them by accident and called them blessings. They said such warmth was not natural, that it rose from ancient fires still smouldering far below. A few dared to spend the night in those hidden hollows, claiming to wake with new strength and dreams they could not describe. Whether they found real heat or only their own faith made manifest, no one could say. Over time, these myths merged into ritual. When the first storm of winter arrived, villagers touched the ground and murmured a single line, Asterisk, keep us as you kept them. Asterisk, no one needed to explain who them was. It was everyone who had ever survived before the ancestors, the old sleepers, the silent saints buried under ice. The earth was not grave but archive. Each season's endurance sank into it, waiting to be remembered. By spring, the stories softened. The Frost Mother became a patron of rebirth. The Hollow Men turned into guardians of thresholds, and the whispering walls were said to guide lost souls toward light. Even fear was transformed, melted like snow into the stream of living memory. Children ran barefoot where months before the ground had been a sealed world of secrets. They laughed, and the old ones smiled, knowing that laughter was another way of honoring the silence below. The myths did not fade because they were false. They endured because they carried truth shaped by frost and hunger. Every tale preserved the same lesson, that what sleeps in darkness is not gone, it is gathering strength. The people who whispered these stories were not inventing gods or ghosts. They were trying to make peace with the cold's patience, with the way life must vanish to return. Even now, when snow falls and the ground tightens its grip, the earth feels inhabited. There is a sense that beneath the surface, someone or something listens still. Perhaps it is only memory. Perhaps memory itself is a kind of spirit, one that refuses to freeze. And as the thaw begins again, the people remember what their ancestors knew, that warmth is never lost, only hidden. It waits, beneath the frost, dreaming in the dark, until the living are ready to remember it once more. Enduring winter was never just a matter of flesh or shelter, it was a test of the soul. Each cold season pressed upon the heart like a weight that could either crush or refine. The people of the Middle Ages understood this intuitively. The frost outside was only a mirror of the frost within. To survive the long darkness was to wrestle quietly with despair, to discover what remained when comfort had gone. They believed that every winter carved the soul the way rivers carve stone, slowly, invisibly, but forever. For monks, this trial was sacred discipline. The cold reminded them of humility, of dependence, of their smallness before creation. In their records they wrote of frosted grace, the idea that suffering purified belief. A monk waking before dawn to pray in a chapel colder than the world outside saw his own breath rise like incense. To him, each exhale was confession, each tremor a kind of offering. They said the soul grew brighter when the body grew numb, that endurance was prayer made visible. But the peasants knew a different theology, one born from necessity rather than doctrine. Their faith was not recited, it was lived in the rhythm of work and waiting. When crops failed and food thinned, they still knelt before their hearths, whispering the same words as always: gratitude first, petition second. Gratitude for the breath still visible, for the fire still breathing, for the simple fact of another dawn. They believed the divine could be found in endurance itself, in the stubborn refusal to curse the cold. Each person carried winter differently. Some bore it in silence, others in song. There were those who wept openly, and those who hardened like the ice they walked upon. Yet every reaction held the same truth. The cold stripped life of illusion. There was no pretense under frost. The proud farmer and the pauper both shivered alike. The candlelight fell evenly on their faces. In that equality of suffering, many found a strange peace. The world felt honest, purified by hardship. It was said that during the harshest years, when frost killed even the old trees and the rivers turned to glass, people experienced moments of clarity so sharp it frightened them. Hunger, exhaustion, the hum of survival together, they cleared the mind of noise. Some described it as standing before a door they could not see, sensing a vast presence waiting beyond. Others called it madness. The church called it grace. Old healers taught that the soul, like the body, learned resilience through exposure. Too much comfort, they warned, made the heart fragile. They told stories of spirits who lived forever in warmth and forgot the meaning of gratitude. Those spirits, they said, envied the living who still felt the sting of cold. To shiver is to be blessed, one proverb said. It means the soul remembers. The saying endured for centuries, carried like a quiet prayer through frozen generations. Among the villagers, the test of winter was also moral. The hungry shared with the hungrier, the strong lifted the weak. Every act of kindness gained new weight when measured against scarcity. To give up bread when you had only one loaf was not generosity, it was defiance of despair. They believed such deeds left marks on the soul, invisible light that could be seen only after death. Even the smallest mercy became eternal. And yet, there were moments when faith fractured. People cursed the cold, cursed heaven, cursed their own breath for steaming and reminding them they were still alive. Those nights were the truest trials. To survive them meant to rebuild faith not from doctrine, but from the simple rhythm of survival. One more fire lit, one more door unbroken, one more morning faced. They learned that belief was not certainty, but persistence. Pilgrims who wandered between villages often spoke of revelations found in the snow. The world stripped of colour forced them inward. The mind became mirror and maze. One pilgrim wrote that he saw visions in frost patterns, entire stories traced in the glass of frozen water. He claimed they taught him patience, that each pattern melted when stared at too long, proving that beauty demanded surrender. Faith, he wrote, is like frost. It appears only when the air grows still. In the deep cold, some experienced what they called the second silence, a stillness beyond hearing. It came when storms ceased and snow blanketed everything. In that perfect quiet, even thoughts seemed to slow. People described feeling watched, not by danger, but by understanding, as if the world itself acknowledged their endurance. They said that whoever could listen without fear in that silence would never be alone again. For many, winter's suffering transformed into devotion. When warmth returned, they did not forget what the cold had taught. They built small shrines of gratitude from stones thawed out of the fields. On them, they carved simple words, *, we endured. To endure was to affirm life's fragile holiness. The monks wrote that the soul, once tested by winter, never fully thawed. A piece of the cold remained, clear and hard, like a shard of glass hidden in the heart. It was both scar and strength. That fragment reminded them of their limits, of the thin line between survival and surrender. Without it, they said, joy would lose its depth. So each year, as the first frost formed, people greeted it not only with dread but with a kind of respect. They bowed their heads, murmured small prayers, and prepared to learn again what it meant to survive. For them, the return of winter was not punishment, it was invitation. A chance to remember that beneath the ache of living, something unbreakable endured. And as the world slept under its blanket of ice, the soul learned its oldest lesson, that warmth is most precious when it is earned, that light shines truest when surrounded by darkness, and that faith, once tempered by the cold, can outlast even the longest night. From such trials, spring was not simply a season, it was resurrection, and the first thaw would come like grace itself. The thaw never arrived suddenly. It came first as a rumour, a change in the smell of the air, a soft note beneath the wind's old song. Snow began to sag, heavy and tired of itself. Roofs dripped like clocks made of water, and fields that had been white for months revealed thin veins of brown. To those who had endured the long silence, these small sounds were music. The world was remembering how to breathe. No one trusted the first signs of spring. The people had seen false thaws before gentle days that ended in cruel freezes, yet hope bloomed in them anyway, fragile as the first buds of green. They opened doors cautiously, letting the air flow through rooms thick with smoke and breath. It was still cold, but the cold had changed its tone. It no longer bit, it brushed. It no longer demanded, it asked. The land was exhaling. When the first bird sang, it startled everyone. The sound was too bright, too alive. Some crossed themselves instinctively, others simply stood still, listening. They said that birds carried the souls of those who hadn't survived the winter, returning in song to remind the living of the debt owed to endurance. Every chirp was a resurrection hymn. In that fragile music, the boundary between the living and the gone seemed to dissolve. Communities celebrated not with grand festivals but with quiet gratitude. They called them the rebirth feasts. The first was small bread, baked with the last of the old flour, broth simmered from roots that had nearly dried to dust. It was not abundance that moved them to tears, but the taste of freshness, the sudden bite of green onion, or the sweetness of thawed honey. They broke their fasts slowly, as though afraid to wake from a dream. Some wept at the flavour of milk again, or at the simple crunch of a turnip pulled from thawed ground. In these moments, pagan and Christian rites blended like meltwater streams merging in spring. Villagers lit fires on hills, their flames dancing against the last patches of snow. They said the smoke called back the sun. Monks blessed these gatherings but knew their roots were older than the church. The people weren't celebrating doctrine, they were celebrating survival, the triumph of warmth over stillness, of breath over silence. In their eyes, the thaw was proof that the world still kept its promises. Children played in puddles that reflected the sky. They chased one another through fields that squelched beneath their boots. Laughter returned easily, as if it had been waiting just beneath the ice. The elders watched, smiling through tears, remembering those who hadn't lived to see this day. They said the dead were part of the thaw, that their warmth had helped bring it about. "The ground drinks their memory," one woman whispered, "and gives us back life." As the rivers broke open, people gathered along their banks to watch the ice drift away. The sound was immense, cracking, grinding, roaring like thunder. Some knelt and touched the water, letting it sting their fingers. They called it the blood of the earth, flowing again after long sleep. In that gesture, there was reverence and renewal. The same current that had once threatened to drown now promised rebirth. Feasts followed the flow. Tables were set outdoors, covered with whatever remained of last year's stores and the first shoots of the new. No one ate alone. Bread was broken and passed from hand to hand. Each person who received it said a small blessing not for wealth, but for endurance. "We stayed," they murmured, "and the world stayed with us." They toasted with thin ale, raised in cracked cups, and the laughter that followed was unlike any other sound in the year. It was laughter born from exhaustion, gratitude, and disbelief that life continued. At night, the fires burned brighter than any winter hearth. Flames leapt high enough to scatter sparks among the stars. People danced around them barefoot, feeling mud between their toes, the warmth of the earth rising again. The monks in distant cloisters watched from hilltops, smiling at the silhouettes moving against the glow. Even in their solemnity, they felt the pull of joy. In their chants the next morning, they added new lines, psalms that spoke of thaw, of melting, of mercy. The rebirth feasts were not just gratitude for survival, they were promises to remember. Each year the people swore to live more gently, to waste less, to keep faith with the earth that had held them through the dark. They knew these vows would fade with comfort, yet making them mattered. To renew the vow was itself a kind of prayer. "The earth forgives," said an old farmer, "but only if we remember her hunger." When the last snow disappeared, the fields looked raw and scarred. Ploughs cut into the softened ground like pens writing new scripture. Seeds were cast, not with hope alone, but with remembrance. Every grain carried the memory of nights spent praying for morning. The act of planting became liturgy, the hand sowing, and the soil receiving joined in a sacred exchange. Even the wind felt different. It no longer howled, it hummed. The same people who had huddled in silence now spoke openly, voices spilling into open air. They recounted their dreams from the long, cold visions of light, of ancestors, of strange calm in the darkest hours. These dreams were treated like messages, guiding the coming season's work. The community listened, for in a world that had nearly gone still, every dream was precious. By mid-spring, winter's grip was a memory, but one that shaped everything it released. People smiled more easily, but also carried a deeper quiet within them. They had seen the world without colour, and watched it awaken again. They had lived the pattern of death and return. To them, resurrection was not myth, it was muscle memory. And so they gave thanks not only for the thaw, but for the cold that made the thaw matter. They understood that life's warmth could only be measured against the darkness it survived. The world had spoken its oldest sermon. Nothing stays frozen forever. And as the fields brightened under sun and birdsong, they knew winter would come again. But next time, they would greet it differently, not as an enemy, but as a teacher returning to remind them what endurance truly meant. Time has a way of softening edges and of erasing them completely. The wisdom that once guided people through the long winters began to fade, not through disbelief, but through comfort. Fire grew easier to summon, food easier to keep. The small rituals that had once meant survival came to seem quaint, even foolish. What had once been knowledge turned to superstition. What had once been reverence became embarrassment. The old ways did not vanish in a single generation, they were buried slowly, like embers cooling beneath ash. The church and the crown both had reasons to encourage forgetting. They needed order, not memory. Rituals that involved speaking to snow, whispering to fire, or listening to the ground were too intimate, too ungoverned. Faith, they said, must rise upward, not downward. To them, prayers directed to frost or soil smelled of heresy. And so, the surviving monks copied their texts carefully, omitting details that blurred the line between miracle and nature. The manuscripts that once contained recipes for warmth and preservation were redrafted as moral lessons. The practical vanished into the spiritual. Village by village, the teachings that had once passed by word of mouth began to stumble. Younger generations moved to towns, chasing work in growing industries that promised security. The communal hearth gave way to the private stove. The songs that had taught the rhythm of snowfalls were replaced by hymns about salvation in the next world, rather than survival in this one. The earth, once partner and teacher, became backdrop. Some of the erasure was deliberate. Officials sent from cities collected tales for records of superstition, listing charms against frost and sickness alongside confessions of witchcraft. A woman who hung herbs above her doorway was questioned for sorcery. A man who blessed his fire with old words was warned by priests. Their children learned to keep silent about the old practices. What was not spoken began to fade. But knowledge resists oblivion in quiet ways. It hides in habit, in reflex, in the way hands still move without thought. In the deep countryside, families continued to bank their fires under ash each night, calling it efficiency, not magic. Farmers turned soil by the same pattern their ancestors used, guided by instinct they could no longer name. They crossed themselves before first frost, not out of fear but because the motion felt right. Forgotten origins clung like warmth to gesture. Occasionally, fragments surfaced. A traveller's diary from the 17th century describes peasants in a remote valley who greeted the first snow by standing silent until the last flake fell. They said it taught patience to the air. Scholars dismissed it as rural oddity, missing its quiet continuity with rituals 1,000 years older. Another record, written by a soldier wintering in the Alps, mentions locals who buried bread crusts for the hidden ones below. He thought them mad. They thought him pitiful for not knowing who kept the mountain standing. The more the world brightened with reason, the darker its forgotten corners became. Candlelight was replaced by gas, gas by electricity, and the night lost its sanctity. The hush that once made people listen disappeared beneath engines and clocks. The modern age conquered cold with insulation and power, but in the victory, something slipped away, the humility that came from needing to cooperate with the elements. The ancients had feared the cold, yes, but they had also conversed with it. Now, people only avoided it. Historians would later unearth traces of those dialogues in places they hadn't expected, in architectural oddities, in strange notations in old cookbooks, in lullabies whose lyrics no one truly understood. They found designs for hearths that trapped heat with impossible efficiency, methods of preservation that science only recently rediscovered. Each discovery hinted at a network of understanding long dismissed as myth. Yet even as evidence accumulated, the academic world hesitated to admit that the forgotten might still hold truth. The church quietly repurposed some of the imagery it had once condemned. Saints of winter replaced spirits of frost. Prayers for endurance borrowed phrases from older invocations. The Frost Mother became Saint Brigid. Her lamp transformed into a symbol of eternal faith rather than the mercy of death. Legends were rewritten, but the shape of the stories stayed the same. In this way, the forbidden survived inside, the accepted, disguised, yet enduring. What was lost most completely was the attitude beneath the knowledge, the awareness that survival was collaboration. To the old world, humanity was not ruler but participant, one more fragile being negotiating with wind and soil. The erasure was not only cultural but philosophical. The modern age's belief in mastery replaced the medieval sense of dialogue. In warmth's triumph, the humility of endurance was forgotten. And yet, memory leaves residue. Deep in rural Europe, anthropologists found families who still observed listening nights at winter's onset. They sat with all lights extinguished, hearing the wind, the ticking of the fire, the subtle creaks of settling beams. When asked why, they shrugged. Because the world listens back. They could not explain where they had learned it. The past had left its mark in the rhythm of living. Some fragments hid in plain sight. The old banking of embers, the silent blessing of bread, the custom of keeping a single candle lit through storms, all survived, stripped of their stories. To most, they were merely tradition, comfort for long nights. But for those who listened carefully, these gestures still murmured the old language of partnership. The forgotten had not vanished entirely. It had gone underground, like the sleepers beneath the frost. Modern minds might call it coincidence, yet perhaps forgetting is never total. The same earth that holds bones also holds memory. And when cold winds sweep across the fields at dusk, stirring dust and scenting the air with smoke, the body recalls something older than reason. The instinct to pause, to bow the head, to whisper gratitude for the breath still visible in the air. History may have erased the names, burned the records, rewritten the faiths, but the wisdom remains where it always did, in the silence between heartbeats, in the brief flicker of warmth before darkness returns. What was forgotten waits not in books, but in the bones that still remember how to shiver. And soon, that forgotten warmth would begin to rise again, called back by those who felt the cold of their own century, and began to search backward for the fire once hidden beneath the frost. It began quietly, as rediscoveries often do. A historian found a marginal note in a crumbling manuscript, an instruction on how to breathe warmth into the coal before prayer. Another researcher unearthed sketches of houses half buried in hillsides, labelled in Latin as Times Domus Viva *, the living home. None of it seemed remarkable at first, just fragments from a world long past. But to those who lingered on them, they carried a strange familiarity, as though the knowledge had not been lost but only sleeping. The more they looked, the more they found. Across Europe, whispers of revival began to stir. In remote valleys, old families still practiced traditions without realizing their age. They stored grain in sealed earthen jars, built ovens of clay that glowed all night, and kept memory flames from one year's fire to the next. When scholars asked about these customs, the villagers only shrugged. "We do as our grandmothers did," they said. The scholars realized they were standing inside living museums. The very knowledge thought extinct still flickered in ordinary life. Architects studying medieval ruins found that ancient builders had mastered warmth in ways modern design had forgotten. Their walls breathed. Their rooms regulated temperature without fuel. Builders in the present began to copy these methods using straw and clay, stone and air to create houses that stayed warm even in bitter frost. What had once been dismissed as primitive became revolutionary. They called it passive design. The peasants of centuries past had called it survival. Food historians rediscovered recipes that defied decay, fermented roots, smoked herbs, and spiced broths whose flavors carried comfort far beyond nutrition. Chefs began to recreate them, fascinated by the balance between preservation and healing. They realized the medieval palate had understood the relationship between spice, warmth, and spirit better than modern science. Cinnamon and pepper were not indulgence. They were inner fire. Even spiritual seekers joined the rediscovery. The world had grown loud, bright, and hurried. People longed again for quiet. Monastic retreats filled with visitors seeking the peace of darkness, the calm rhythm of candle and chant. Some revived the listening hours, sitting awake through the stillest part of the night, waiting for silence to speak. They found, as the monks once had, that the mind clears when the world withdraws. What had been ascetic ritual became therapy for modern unrest. Archaeologists mapped networks of subterranean tunnels once used as winter shelters. Many were older than the churches above them, their walls carved with symbols of circles and hands. When they studied the layout, they found it mirrored constellations visible in medieval skies. Perhaps by accident, perhaps by design, the people underground had aligned their refuge with the heavens. They lived between earth and sky, one researcher wrote, and built both into their walls. As discoveries spread, a pattern emerged. The old world had never separated practicality from meaning. Every gesture had been double-edged, feeding the body while tending the soul, preserving warmth while honoring mystery. Modern minds struggled with this unity. They wanted function or faith, not both. But the forgotten knowledge resisted division. It insisted that survival itself was sacred. Writers and filmmakers began to tell these stories anew. Documentaries showed villagers lighting fires with ancestral gestures, monks chanting through frostbitten nights, craftsmen shaping ovens from river clay. Viewers watching in their heated rooms felt an ache. They couldn't name a longing not for hardship, but for intimacy with the elements. The images spoke of something missing in their own comfort, the sense of belonging to the world's rhythm rather than standing apart from it. Soon, workshops appeared across countries, ancestral crafts, earth living, silent nights. People gathered not as historians but as participants. They learned to bank embers, to read snow, to cook slowly, to share stories in low voices, while storms moved outside. These weren't reenactments, they were attempts at reconnection. As one participant wrote, "We are not imitating the past, we are remembering what it means to stay alive together." Scientists began confirming what the ancients had known by instinct. Shared body heat could reduce hypothermia faster than fire. Fermented foods strengthened endurance through winter months. Sleep divided in 2 phases improved rest. Even the practice of sitting in silence during darkness lowered the body's stress. The lines between folklore and fact blurred until they vanished. Knowledge once labelled superstition now re-emerged as wisdom backed by evidence. Still, the revival was not without resistance. Some mocked it as nostalgia, an escape from modern life's responsibility. But those who embraced it weren't running away, they were returning. They understood that in rediscovering the forgotten, they weren't stepping backward but completing a circle. Progress without memory was a half-truth. Warmth without reverence, an illusion. One historian described visiting an old mountain village where, during the first frost of winter, people still placed bread on their windowsills. He asked why. An old woman smiled and said, "For the frost spirits." Then, after a pause, she added, "Or maybe for ourselves." To remind us to share, that answer was enough. The ritual no longer needed a name. Its wisdom remained intact. In archives and attics, letters from centuries past resurfaced. Farmers wrote to their sons about how to endure the black months, not with fear but with patience. One line appeared again and again, asterisk, "Do not fight the cold. Learn its rhythm." Asterisk. The phrase became a motto for the modern revivalists. It captured the old truth perfectly. Survival was not conquest, it was conversation. As the movement grew, something subtle shifted in the world's relationship with winter. Instead of shrinking from it, people began to watch it again, to notice the silence, to listen to snow, to let darkness rest over them without rush. They learned to see beauty in scarcity, meaning in quiet. And in that gentle observation, they rediscovered the same warmth that had once sustained their ancestors. Because what was lost had never truly gone, it had simply gone quiet, waiting for the noise of centuries to fade. And now, as the modern world slowed to listen, the forgotten voices of the cold began to speak again, telling the same story they had told 1,000 years before. That every ember of wisdom, once buried, still burns beneath the frost, patient as breath, ready to rise the moment someone remembers to look for its glow. It begins again, as it always has with silence. The fields stretch wide beneath a grey sky, the air holding its breath between seasons. The last leaves tremble and let go. Frost gathers quietly on the edges of forgotten fences. Somewhere in that hush, the story restarts. The same story it has told for 1,000 winters. That endings are only pauses in a longer rhythm, and that the cold, no matter how deep, is never the final word. To stand in such a landscape is to feel both small and infinite. The land does not remember names, yet it remembers footsteps. Each generation leaves its faint print upon the snow, each convinced it walks for the first time. But the earth knows better. Beneath the frozen crust lies the echo of all who came before, those who built fires against the dark, who whispered to the wind, who learned to love the silence they once feared. The living walk upon their lessons, unaware that the ground beneath them listens. Winter has always been the world's mirror. In its stillness, it reveals what noise conceals, how fragile we are, and how miraculous it is to remain. The ancients did not romanticize their suffering. They accepted it. They saw in the frost not cruelty but clarity. The cold stripped away excess, leaving only truth, breath, hunger, love, endurance. The same truths remain now, though buried under the clutter of comfort. Every winter that returns is an invitation to remember. The rediscovery of the old ways did not bring them back as relics. It revived their essence, attention. The patience to sit with silence, the courage to listen to the unseen, the humility to belong to the earth instead of trying to master it. Those who practice this now, historians, wanderers, ordinary souls seeking quiet, find themselves changed in small but certain ways. They walk slower. They notice the way light falls on snow, the rhythm of their breath in the cold air. They speak less, hear more. In that slowing, something ancient moves again inside them. Perhaps this is what the monks meant when they wrote of frosted grace. To live through hardship is to see the beauty within it, not because pain is noble, but because it clarifies the sacredness of warmth. A single flame means more when darkness presses close. The sound of laughter becomes treasure when it rises above wind. The miracle is not that spring follows winter. It is that, through winter, life continues at all. In every age, people have feared disappearance of warmth, of memory, of meaning. Yet history itself shows a gentler truth. Nothing truly vanishes. It transforms, hides, hibernates. The old survival methods, the rituals, the beliefs, they were never lost. They simply became quiet, waiting for the next generation willing to listen. Now that the world listens again, the cold responds. Not as enemy, but as teacher. You can feel it in the way frost forms on window glass, delicate as breath. Each pattern, a message written in silence. Modern science explains it as physics. The heart feels it as poetry. Both are correct. The universe speaks in multiple languages, and winter is one of them. It tells us that stillness is not emptiness, that slowing down is not failure, that life's quietest moments are its most instructive. Those who have sat through the longest nights understand this. The cold does not kill hope, it shapes it. It teaches that hope must burn from within, that external warmth fades but inner fire endures. The peasants knew it when they shared body heat around a dying hearth. The monks knew it when they sang into the dark. The wanderers knew it when they buried their embers beneath snow to find them glowing at dawn. Each act was the same declaration. Life will not be silenced. Even now, surrounded by modern light, people seek that same defiance. They turn off their lamps, sit by a single candle, and let the shadows stretch. They close their eyes, and feel the pulse of their own blood slow, steady, older than thought. For a moment, they touch the same calm their ancestors found in caves and cloisters, the same quiet conviction that the universe, vast and cold, still hums with warmth beneath its surface. It is easy to forget this, in a world obsessed with brightness. We chase light endlessly, mistaking glare for guidance. But true illumination, as the ancients knew, comes from contrast. Without darkness, light loses meaning. Without silence, music is noise. Without winter, warmth is mere temperature, not miracle. The old world did not seek to escape the cold. It sought to understand it. To them, endurance was not resistance, it was relationship. There are moments now rare but unmistakable when that relationship stirs again. A traveller steps into a quiet forest after snowfall and feels the air thicken with presence. A child watches frost creep across glass and feels wonder instead of fear. A monk in a modern abbey hears the same midnight bell that rang 1,000 years ago and senses time folding around him. In these moments, the cold whispers back. It says, "Asterisk, I was never against you. I was teaching you how to feel alive." Asterisk. Perhaps that is why so many of the old tales end not with victory, but with listening. The frost mother's hand, gentle on the brow of the dying, the hum beneath the ground, the stars reflecting on ice. All spoke of harmony, not conquest. The lesson was never to overcome nature, but to move with it, to find warmth in the shared rhythm between world and body. Standing in winter's heart, one can almost hear that rhythm. The faint creak of trees, the slow sigh of wind, the steady pulse within one's own chest. The boundaries blur until you cannot tell where you end and the world begins. That is the secret the ancients carried. Survival was not separation, it was unity. As the world warms in new and unsettling ways, some have begun to long for that balance again. They sense that comfort without connection breeds emptiness. The revival of old wisdom is not nostalgia, it is necessity. We are remembering not only how to endure the cold, but how to honor it. In doing so, we rediscover reverence for the fragile balance that sustains all warmth. In the deepest sense, winter is a mirror of the human spirit. Both hold within them a core of fire surrounded by silence. The ancients saw this clearly. When they spoke of keeping the flame alive, they were not speaking only of hearths. They meant the fire that lives behind the ribs, the quiet persistence that refuses to die even when everything around it freezes. That is the flame we inherit. That is the fire that turns endurance into meaning. And so, when the cold whispers back, it is not warning but remembrance. It says, asterisk, you have survived before, you will again. Asterisk. Each frost, each silence, each return of darkness is part of the same cycle that has guided humanity since the first spark was struck against stone. We are not apart from it. We are the continuation of its breath. Somewhere tonight, someone will light a candle against the cold. Someone will share a story, sing softly, or press their palm against another's for warmth. They may not know they are reenacting a ritual older than language, but the earth will recognize it. The wind will pause. The cold will listen. Because in the end, that is all winter ever wanted to be acknowledged, to be heard, to be part of the conversation of life. And in that listening, everything becomes clear again. The frost is not the end of warmth, it is its beginning. The darkness is not the absence of light, it is the space that allows it to shine. As the snow falls outside and the world settles into stillness, one truth remains unchanged across centuries. The warmth we seek has always been within us, waiting to be remembered. And when we finally stop to listen to the wind, to the silence, to the heartbeat beneath the frost, the cold will whisper its final secret. Asterisk. You were never alone in the dark. Asterisk. Asterisk. You never will be. Asterisk.